hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are based in the world watching the stream. We're really excited to have you on today to be discussing how the next wave of people analytics has the power to push DEI&B efforts further. So with that, I will give a really quick introduction of myself and the rest of the panelists. My name is Tanmay Manohar, of course. I'm VP of People Analytics and Workforce Planning at Paramount. And it's a position I started in a few years ago. We didn't used to have a people analytics department. I used to be in advanced advertising and doing marketing analytics. Received some requests to help from our recruiting team. One request became two, became three, became four. Eventually, it led me to pitch to my chief people officer and chief data officer, hey, would you let me take a stab at starting the function? So here we are a couple of years later, building out the team, doing some great work in DEI, which I'm excited to share with you all. And I want to introduce, take the time to have our panelists introduce ourselves. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll go just in order. I will ask Roxanne to start and just share a little bit about yourself and your position.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I'm so happy to be here today. So Roxanne Laczo, I am an industrial organizational psychologist by trade, currently the head of people analytics at Cloudflare. Now, us IO psychologists will say that we've been doing people analytics for a long time before it was called people analytics. So I really think of myself more as a behavioral scientist or even an HR strategy expert in terms of thinking about holistically around the whole HR space. How do we really use our talent, data, and insights to help the business make better decisions? I'm based in Austin, Texas, where it's actually chilly here as well, believe it or not. And I love dogs. I love being outside, and I'm just super excited to be here with everybody today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roxanne. We'll kick it over to Michele.
Thanks, Tanmay. Hi, everybody. So in my work, I help companies to perform at their best through their people. I started in management consulting and then moved on to people analytics and people strategy at Nestle, and then led the people analytics and operations team at Victoria's Secret. And I've worked pretty closely with DE&I teams to help them establish baselines to set strategies and measure progress on some important initiatives. And I'm really looking forward to contributing to the conversation today.
Perfect. Thank you, Michele. Jamie's up next.
Hey, Tanmay, and thank you very much. So Jamie Nevsheir, so I work for NBCUniversal. So that's Universal Pictures and NBC, the network. Obviously, English accent for an American company. I'm based in London. So time zones is always fun for me. But I started in management consulting as well. So as a few of the panelists have been here. So it's great to kind of be here with you, Tanmay, on the kind of media front, and joined NBC about 6 years ago. And then for the last 3 years, we've been trying to stand up a people analytics function. So it's been kind of a slow growth, but we've kind of had a bit of acceleration because of the pandemic and things. So really excited to be here to kind of share some of the stories that we've gone through, some of the things that we've done in the DEI space, and chat to all the other panelists and you, Tanmay. So thank you very much for having us.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Adrienne.
Thanks for having me, Tanmay, and I look forward to talking to the rest of the panelists today. My name is Adrienne Block. I am a director of Workforce Analytics and Innovation at Mastercard, where I've been for about 3 years now. I come from, my love of data comes from a background in science, which I brought all the way over into people analytics, getting to apply it to people and see the real-time outcomes. And making everyone's work life a little bit better has kept me motivated for the last few years, and many to come, I expect. So thanks for having me.
Wonderful. It sounds like we've got a great variety of backgrounds, a great variety of levels of progression and sophistication across people analytics and workforce analytics. So it's going to, I'm sure, be a very exciting conversation amongst ourselves. So I like to kick things off with something positive. So I'm going to ask all of you to share a win. So I wanted to ask you, can you all share an initiative that you are most proud of from the past couple of years that has had a lasting impact beyond what we call the confetti culture that DEI initiatives sometimes represent? That's usually the one event a year, everyone pats themselves on the back and then calls it a day and moves on. So what's something you're proud of from the past couple of years in the DEI space? And we'll go in the same order as the introduction. So let's start with Roxanne.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the example I'll give, it's not very complex or sophisticated, but it's very foundational in terms of really starting to elevate how you look at DEI being an organization. And it's really around data enablement and data democratization. So something we've done is basically just created these self-service dashboards where leaders and managers and VPs and other interested users can actually access and track how we're doing in terms of representation across our entire workforce. This is the first time that we've really been able to enable this level of access to data. So while it's very foundational and very simple, it actually changes the nature of the conversations that our recruiting team, that our VPs can have with leaders, and really allows them to have more strategic discussions when they're thinking about what is our strategy around this going forward.
That's fantastic. And I think, really getting data and getting insights into the hands of the individuals who are directly able to apply it is key, and I think is a grail for all people analytics practitioners. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, the example I'll share has to do with improving retention of diverse employees, which I know is an ongoing challenge for many organizations. So I was in an organization where we were looking at year-end talent metrics and saw that there had been an increase in diverse departures. So after we did some digging, we saw that people with a diverse background tended to be leaving the company within 2 or 3 years of joining, and also that managers weren't really clear on the reasons for leaving. So that kind of tipped us off that it was something to do with the rapport between the manager and the diverse employee wasn't strong enough, or could be stronger, in other words. So we piloted a simple toolkit that we had used for retaining talent of our high performers. And it's a pretty straightforward process, but you first give a quick diagnostic that the employee takes, and it emphasizes the importance, what's important to them, where their focus and motivations are, and then followed by a structured conversation with the manager about what their interests are, how to break down barriers and obstacles, and come up with some concrete plan for moving forward. And so we implemented that. It was very well received. We started seeing that more dialogue between employees and their managers. And it taught me a few things. One thing was that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. Secondly, that it's okay to recycle toolkits and materials that you already have and adapt them for a new purpose. And most of all, I think it reinforces the importance of listening and the value of listening to learn what motivates people.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely no need to reinvent the wheel. If you already have tools at your disposal and new use cases you can apply them to, that's great. And I think this also speaks to you brought up a good point around thinking about how to retain individuals of diverse backgrounds. So often I think we focus on the attraction side and the recruiting side. How can we bring more diverse candidates into the company? And part of our conversation today is on the inclusion and belonging part of things to actually keep employees once they're at your company. So I think we'll have there's a lot to unpack there that I'm sure we'll get into. Next up is Jamie.
Yeah, thanks, Tanmay. And I'm going to ask if I can kind of say two, because they kind of blend quite well with what Roxanne's just said and what Michele's just said. So definitely one of the big initiatives that we've kind of managed to land over the last 2 years is to stand up a self-service dashboard that, like Roxanne was talking about, that kind of serves up all of the different metrics across the kind of employee life cycle that HR would need, or would be able to look at. One of those key elements is being able to dive deeper into your diversity data or DEI data. So we've kind of built that, and we call it People Insights. So it's kind of a one-stop shop for lots of different metrics. So that's really helped kind of HR to get closer to some of the numbers, understand some of those numbers, bring those things together. So looking at what's your kind of attrition levels, but looking at that in conjunction with what's your joiners and how many people are coming in with promotions as well. So it's kind of blending all that together. So that's really helped kind of start to give big insights, start to look down into kind of what some of the certain hotspots are where we need to look at. So that's kind of been really well received, and a lot of the HR groups are using that tool now. The other thing that we've done that I'm really proud of is in the media space, we started to look at our productions. So we started to look at our TV productions and bringing down some of the data that we can get there to understand what's the mix. And I think a lot of the focus in DI, especially in the middle phase, is what we call above the line. So that's your directors, producers, you're in front of the camera type of talent. What we've done is started to look at what's behind the camera. So what we call that's below the line. and started to look at what our crew looks like and what's the diversity mix of our crew, show by show, season by season, genre by genre, all of those different kind of cuts. And then going back to your point, you were just saying, Michele, looking at what's the retention. So we know on shows, there's a lot of shows obviously have season after season. We have some long running shows that have the same crew that seem to kind of churn over and over and over again. So we wanted to kind of pinpoint where we're seeing that. And it's really helped kind of a lot of the producers, a lot of the kind of groups in our TV production to look more closely at kind of what their crew levels look like, what are the different groups that we have, especially grips and things like that, that can be kind of very much one side from a, so if we call it sex instead of gender, so very kind of male orientated. So that's kind of really helped to start to change the needle in that space. So yeah, definitely two things. So sorry, I've kind of spread it out, not just one, but definitely those two things.
Always great to hear more than one wit if it's available. And that really resonates with me, Jamie, being in entertainment and media myself at Paramount. We're also looking at productions ourselves. And I think there's a really strong focus in the industry on, if we're telling stories about our audience, how do we make sure that we ourselves reflect the audience in terms of our staff? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a fantastic initiative to be part of and to be driving the charge on. So next up is Adrienne.
Thanks, Tanmay. I think when I look back at the last year, I think one of the things that shines to me as a bright spot is our ability to influence the location strategy of Mastercard. To look at our opportunity to recruit diverse talent through a lens of enabling remote work, but still having people feel connected, and actually bringing forward the data that said, we have these goals, these objectives, we want to diversify the workforce, and we can do that by diversifying how we think about our workforce and where our workforce is. And as much as we know together is priceless, we can also enter new markets to bring in fresh ideas from other fintech businesses, and actually seeing that go from ideas and data to investment, and translating into jobs in new markets where we're connected to the society aspects of our business and supporting small businesses in those communities has been really, really rewarding.
That's fantastic. I really like that thought about going from ideas to investment. A lot of times we, as an organization, can, as people analytics practitioners as well, have a lot of insights, and it can be tough sometimes to get our line leaders or HRBPs or whichever stakeholders we're interacting with to actually take action from those insights, and not just look at them as like, oh, that's interesting, and then leave it on the shelf. So it's very exciting to see that there was some real investment made into initiatives and into strengthening the communities in which you operate. So that's fantastic. So I had some questions for each of you, but of course, let's keep this conversational. So if you hear something particularly insightful, or you get curious based on someone's response, please, of course, feel free to interject or share your thoughts as well. So the first question I had, Jamie, this was building on some of the topics that you talked about, and you had mentioned the difference between using even terminology of sex versus gender. So as a company, working at a company that spans 36 countries, what are some of the challenges you faced in terms of creating one unified definition of DEI across the company? And how do you handle those regional differences in terms of what DEI, DEI&B means in these various geographies?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a great question. I think it's something that I think as people analytics leaders, we're all trying to look at now, as what is that global look at DEI. I think everyone knows as a concept and the idea around DEI and where we want that to go. I think we can't be complacent. We always need to stretch further in terms of what we can do and what we can think about. For us at NBCUniversal, I think we're not quite there in terms of being able to look at things globally, especially when we come down to kind of race and ethnicity. I think those are the different areas. I think there's no one universal way that we can look at that globally, and you shouldn't look at that globally. And I think Google and companies like that obviously are kind of pushing the boundaries in terms of looking at the data and how they interpret that data. But for us, obviously our largest footprint is the US. So our kind of focus is very much on the US, but we are also doing things in the UK, given that's kind of one of the second biggest markets outside the US. So every year we run a survey. We call it This Is Us survey, to start to look at what is our demographic across our business in the UK. And a lot of that is kind of also driven by regulation. We have to report to Ofcom. So there's kind of a driver there. That's not to say that we've got a stick that's giving us that push. We have been doing this for a number of years, even before Ofcom were kind of looking at this. So what we do is we look at our workforce. We kind of take the UK census. So the Office of National Statistics kind of pushes out what they look at and the different groups of people that they would want to focus on. And we use that to then focus our questions in that survey around those different groups. And we look at lots of things across the kind of the normal DEI areas, but we also look at things like our caring, who are carers in our business. And that's been really important when we come to look at things like being at home and working at home in the pandemic. That's shifted greatly. So I think that's a kind of a new focus for us to start to look at not just kind of the traditional areas of DI, but look beyond that. So we're still working in that space, still trying to understand how we can do things. We do have footprints in some of the other countries where you do have privacy, some kind of privacy barriers, but I think we don't want that to stop us. But I think places like Germany, there are companies that are doing that and looking at their data there. And I think it's just about being honest. We want to try and disclose as much as we can. We have pushed kind of as much as we can out at the moment. There's still more we can do to disclose our data more publicly, and even to our employees and the workforce. So I think there's always more you can do, but that's just some of the stuff that we're doing. But yeah, welcome to hear anyone else that's kind of working in this space and looking more globally at their data from a DEI perspective.
I mean, I'll add on to Jamie, to what you said. In my experience, we each market has a different need and needs to have a somewhat different definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion that's implemented, but it needs to be under a unified strategy for the whole company. And then from there, it's how do you implement it? How do you measure it in a way that makes sense for that particular region?
And I'll just kind of add in more holistically. You can't make progress on what you can't measure, right? So something I think is really important is this concept of self-ID, right? To what extent employees feel comfortable and safe providing information around kind of our typical outcome metrics. But then I'll also say a lot of the work we focus on is on outcomes and forgetting about the EI&B part of it, right? So measurement is much more broad than how are we doing around representation? Are we creating an inclusive workplace? Are we creating a sense of belonging, especially with the pandemic that changed everything in terms of how we should be and can be thinking about well-being? Are we creating an equitable and fair environment where people feel valued in the same way? So I think even pulling back and thinking about it a little bit more holistically is really important.
At Mastercard, we've been kind of in the reverse situation where instead of pushing things out from the middle, things were sprouting up organically in different markets, in different regions, responding to gender inequities in India in terms of who we were seeing coming through the door was going on long before the diversity, equity, and inclusion group asked them to monitor this, asked them to lean into it and make efforts and reach out to different recruiting groups. So now I think we're bringing everything under the same hood so that we can have a better conversation with the workforce so that they know that the commitment isn't about the most public goal or the one that you've heard a lot about, or, it's not just each individual group. We're really looking for a global inclusive strategy, a globally inclusive culture where everyone's successful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Adrienne. I think, that kind of global inclusivity and how do you use those different groups? I think most organizations have employee resource groups. We definitely have those, and those have been around, I think, for us, starting in even at the end of World War II for NBCUniversal. So it's just now that we kind of start to kind of look at how do those groups kind of network across the organization, especially during the pandemic, that those groups, especially some of the kind of specific ones, like we have one called a BEN, which is a Black Employee Network, and that has expanded, that's grown, and it's a really good focus. It's not just Black employees that can join those groups, it's everyone, it's inclusive to every employee. So I think that's kind of where I think for us is a focus on looking at those groups. How do we use those groups? How do we kind of partner with these different groups as well? And not just think about us as a kind of ivory tower sitting centrally in these functions. So yeah, a really great point, Adrienne.
Yeah, absolutely. We do a similar thing as well with our ERGs, where we, Paramount initially was Viacom and CBS, and we went through a merger 2 years ago. and then rebranded to Paramount. And we had a similar thing where we actually had more consolidated ERGs, and we were finding that wasn't really allowing people to have the space to connect with individuals of their ethnicity, or as parents, or as veterans, as we refer to it in the US. I know that's not the same terminology all around the world, but we found that allowing for kind of subgroups and more targeted ERGs really helped, because now they not only have the ability to connect with their communities and build that safe space where they can discuss topics with each other that are important to their community, but then also we've seen a lot of interaction across the ERGs. And as you mentioned, there's a sense of allyship where you can join even if you're not you don't identify as an individual of that particular group. You're still more than welcome as an ally to be able to join and experience the culture and the empathize with individuals in your community. So I think it's a great point. Roxanne mentioned something a little earlier around what gets measured gets done, and you can't really make any progress without it. And I wanted to ask Adrienne if you could dig in a little bit into that, based on the example you gave from Mastercard, where certain issues were popping up before there was a unified DEI&B strategy in place. When we talk about the inclusion, equity, belonging aspect, how does Mastercard measure success and develop the measures for success in that area? Especially considering that a lot of times people think of diversity and they immediately jump to representation, but there might not be as much focus placed on the other side of the equation as well. So how does that work at Mastercard, and how do you set metrics against that?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Tanmay. Thanks. And I want to echo what Roxanne said. Representation is the outcome of a truly inclusive culture, a truly inclusive strategy. For us, our perspectives on inclusion is really about having a conversation with employees and giving them voice. So, we have our inclusion index that's part of our annual survey, but that rolls up all the way to, we launched something called a cultural health index, because as we're growing as an organization, our board challenged us to really think about how we could maintain the culture of Mastercard as we go from a company that I think 10 years ago was around 5,000 people, and today is somewhere around 27,000. And as we expand our geographies, how do we ensure that the culture here, the experience of the employees in Atlanta, the remote employees, St. Louis, New York, how do we ensure that they're having the same experience, that they have that same sense of belonging? And that level of accountability, that board visibility of, what are employees telling us about inclusion, has driven so much of our conversation and so much of what we measure. So it's clear that we ask them very directly, are people treated fairly? Have we created the right environment for everyone to succeed? But within all of our other questions, we're always looking for opportunities from a DEI perspective, right? So there's just those few questions in the precious real estate of employee attention in the survey. There's just a few questions that are DEI focused, but really keeping that DEI lens as you analyze all of the data, all of the measures, understanding if responses are different in one location versus another, for one ethnicity versus another, for employees whose supervisors in the same office are not in the same office. Really getting into all of the texture of how that employee experience varies has been a critical part of how we identify opportunities to increase that sense of belonging.
That's super insightful. I mean, I like this phrase, the texture of the employee experience, and digging into all of those connection touch points. I'd be interested to see how everyone else is handling the measurement of inclusion and belonging and equity as well.
So we also, and I haven't, every company I've worked at had some sort of inclusion type index in the employee survey. And I think that's one of the easiest ways to gather that type of data, because typically those surveys are global and census-based survey. And it's just a really simple way to give people kind of a safe commentary in terms of how am I feeling about the environment that my manager is creating, my company is creating, that I feel like I belong, that I feel valued, et cetera. So I think that's a really simple and powerful way to start to capture that data if you haven't already.
I also wanted to ask if anyone's been using organizational network analysis to look at how people form bonds and the networks of different groups within their company.
I wish.
Yeah. Not yet. We might be starting a pilot soon, but it has been an area where, especially our privacy team and legal team and our tech team have been great partners of ours and have raised certain risks that need to be addressed and mitigated first before we dive into that area, especially if we start looking at tracking emails, tracking communications between groups, even if it's anonymized, which most of the tools that are out there are. There's still a sense of identifying how valuable is this to the end employee. Does it mean that we're listening to this information to identify whether or not people are actually taking time off, or whether they're working outside of their standard hours more than they should be? Does it mean that people are shifting their hours in order to be able to accommodate their schedules, either as as caregivers in the household or as something else? If we're going through the process in that way to improve employee well-being, and we're able to communicate that value proposition accurately, I think there's more receptivity from employees to give that information. But I think on the flip side, if it's not handled properly, there's always a sense of apprehension around what's being done with my data. And I think that's really the hurdle that we're trying to tackle now. We may try to pilot it within one particular group or business unit within our company where there is a little bit more receptivity to that, even as an employee population, the culture within that group. But I think that's been our biggest hurdle, to be able to implement ONA more broadly. I don't know if anyone else has had the same experience.
Yeah, I think the same for us, for Tanmay and Adrienne. Yeah, it's a challenge from a data perspective, from a privacy perspective. But I don't want that to kind of be a barrier to us actually doing this and looking at this. I think there's a lot more we can do. I was just on a meeting conversation with Rob Cross, if people are aware of him. He's quite an expert in ONA yesterday. And there's a lot more in the DEI space that we can do to look at kind of things, as I was saying, so employee resource groups, looking at your networks that are created as part of those mentoring and those coaching relationships. It's not just about your physical role that's in the business and what you have. It's about those relationships that you have that kind of more on a kind of a social perspective, and how do we start to look at that? So I think there's a lot more in that space that we can do, and that influences those connection points, those nodes, and how those all connect together as part of that kind of overall organizational glue and that culture that sits behind all that. There's a lot more that we can do in that space. And there's passive and there's surveys in terms of the types of data that you can get. With Microsoft Office 365, there's a lot more that you can kind of look at across there. So yeah, it's kind of finding that line between what's creepy and what's not creepy. I think that's where everyone's kind of got to be careful. So
that's exactly right. And I think, as part of that, it behooves us as people analytics practitioners to make sure that we're responsible for, the review of that technology, to make sure that we're looking at all the validation documentation, and to make sure that everything's scalable, interoperable, all of the things that we're looking at from a tech standpoint, a mathematical standpoint. And I wanted to actually ask Roxanne, I saw in your bio that you have a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology, and that you led various analytics teams at different companies. Speaking of this topic of review and rigor, how important do you think bringing a sense of that scientific rigor is to DEI initiatives? And what's been your experience in terms of the receptivity to that at different companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really important, but I think there's a pretty big gap between receptivity and readiness for that level of rigor. So when I kind of step back, and you mentioned validation earlier, which gave me a warm fuzzy, it's really around, are we even measuring things in a statistically and psychometrically sound way, right? So even beyond DEI, when we look at our talent lifecycle, are we implementing objective programs, creating rating scales, whatever it might be, in a way that's actually psychometrically sound and structured, that we know we're getting good data, right? So kind of starting to think more broadly. If we have a very subjective element in one aspect and we're trying to tie that to DEI measurement, we still have a very subjective outcome. And so what do we do with that data? So I'm really focused on, kind of the organizational readiness. And I think every organization is different. And the Googles of the world are in a very different place than the tech companies of the world, right? And so it's really around how do we really think about laying the foundation for that rigor so we can get to those more advanced places. And I think it was Michele that mentioned it earlier. There's a big difference between, I think, the sophistication of the analysis and the complexity of the analysis. You don't have to do something really fancy to have a really, really big impact. And you can be very scientific and rigorous, but keep it very simple and basic. So I really focus and have focused at every job I've worked at in this space, really around, are we doing the fundamental basics to ensure reliable, consistent, accurate, valid measurement across the life cycle? If we don't have that, it's going to be really hard to move the dial up on the sophistication level around DEI analytics. If we don't have the data in place to even do that, it's not going to be a worthwhile activity. So I spend a lot of time kind of enabling and training people, especially in the HR space, around what that foundational level of sophistication looks like that will help us get to the next level.
That's a great point, making sure that you have your house in order first and that foundation set before you layer on sophistication. I've always thought of the analogy of a garden. If it's overgrown and you add fertilizer to it, things are going to go even more haywire. You first need to make sure that everything is pruned and neat and tidy first before you layer on additional sophistication. And there's always a sense of, at least at Paramount, I always prefer adoption over sophistication if there is a choice between the two. And I really like the distinction you made between you can be scientifically rigorous, but still keep the end product or the end user interface to your consumer simple, to reduce that point of friction for whatever tool or algorithm or whatever it is that they're using. So I think that's an extremely important point. So I know we're moving right along here, and I want to make sure we have time at the end as well to share key takeaways and also create a little bit more time for open discussion too. So the last question that I had sort of preset was for Michele, and this one is related to your time at Victoria's Secret, and VS has recently been updating a lot of their advertising to be more inclusive of various body types, individuals with different backgrounds, representing individuals with disabilities. And it, of course, positions VS's products as more accessible to a broader range of women. And so how do those experiences in engaging with customers relate to the internal workforce?
Yeah, it's been a really exciting time to work at Victoria's Secret. The company has gone through a huge transformation in how it markets to consumers. And for those of you that are familiar or may not be familiar with the company, the Victoria's Secret had a very large impact on what was seen as the ideal woman. But as societal values changed, the company didn't change with it. So there's been an effort to become much more diverse and inclusive in the type of role models that are used, the sizes that are offered, and the social issues that are supported. And it's not just a public relations issue either. There are also concerns raised internally about the treatment of women. So it was both the internal and the external. I mean, based on my observations, I would say that it's really important for the leaders to bring employees along on the consumer journey or the customer journey as things are changing. Employees don't necessarily have to agree with the company's position, but they do need to understand it in order to avoid feeling a conflict with their own values. And that if the company can truly do DEI in a way that makes sense for the company, people will feel pride in the company, which drives engagement. So, I mean, I guess the takeaway of it would be that any industry that markets products and services, whether it be retail or media or anything else, should really look at the connection between DEI internally and externally, and to use the data to be able to measure gaps and progress towards that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, I'd love to hear what everyone else's take is on that. With our panelists, of course, we span media and entertainment, consumer products, technology, financial services. So how have all of your experiences been in that space in terms of using kind of learnings with bridging the gap between your audience and your product versus what's being done internally?
At Mastercard, we've definitely, alongside our internal goals that we've set, we have a very public goal to diversify our VP Plus leadership specific to Black talent that we launched in 2020. And it's a 5-year goal. So escaping that confetti culture aspect of it, just with having that sort of long-term timeline. And then from there, we realized it's not just enough to have these internal talent goals. We also have what we call our market and society pillars. So how are we supporting communities, diverse communities from a small business perspective? How are we supporting communities from these diverse communities? And I love what you said, Michele, because it really does create this positive feedback loop. I know on days from a measurement perspective where I may be feeling frustrated or something like that, I can pivot my own energy by looking at the market, looking at the society, knowing that it's not just about these measurement challenges that we're having internally. It's about a bigger picture of uplift that we can provide for people of different backgrounds.
And I say, yeah, definitely. I think for Michele and you, Adrienne, it's something where all industries, and you're saying from a Mastercard and Victoria speaking for it, but for the media industry, I think that's gone through a lot of kind of scrutiny from a tabloid perspective and media perspective. So I think we've had to look at how do we change things, and there is a push from kind of the awards kind of driving change from kind of what we see on screen and what content do we push out through to advertising. So advertisers now wanting to know kind of what is the diversity of the shows that they're going to be kind of paying to put their adverts on and in between the breaks. So I think it's nice to see that all of these different parts that come together as part of an industry, is a part of your supply chain or part of your procurement strategy is always to look at DEI. And I think that's a focus that we've got on now. And I'm saying about films and TV and the content we produce. So one of the things that we're sort of very small early days tapping into is, what do we understand about we're saying the mix of our crew, what's the mix of our people that are making the productions, and then what's our audience? So we've got Peacock, we've got things like that now. So how can we see what do our audience really want to do? Because at the end of the day, we're serving the customer, we're serving the content, we're serving entertainment. What's the diversity of our audiences, which we can get to know, we have done for years, and then what's the diversity of our shows, and what sort of things resonate with people, and what can we push out that can make sure that we're kind of pushing out more diverse content in that respect. So I think there's lots we can do, definitely lots more we can do, but for us, that's the kind of, what we're doing on industry. And then again, we've got our industry goals, we're putting money back in, so 100 million in terms of the 3 years that we kind of set in 2020 as NBCU to look at social injustice and to kind of bring equity back to society, to certain groups of society. So there's things like that, again, confetti culture stuff, but we've got to do more across the kind of different components that come together as our industries. So.
That's fantastic. And I know we've got just a few minutes left, and we've covered, I think, a whole slew of topics from self-service, scientific rigor, using existing toolkits, regional definitions, ERGs, inclusion indices. How do we bridge the gap between internal and external? I think we've, over 45 minutes, I think we've scratched the surface on all of these topics, and we could probably, double the length of this panel and still have so much to say about the topic. So I want to do a quick round robin across everyone. If you could please share one of your takeaways from the session, and let's go in the reverse order that we did introductions. Just keep everyone on their toes. We'll start with Adrienne.
I really enjoyed the conversation. I really, the idea of what inclusion is and how we succeed in it is getting so much broader. And I heard that in all of the panelists' stories, particularly, Michele and Jamie talking about in front of the camera, behind the camera, the audience. All of this is part of building a stronger inclusive culture. And I think it's just part of why we can be proud that this is the work that we do.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say thank you to everyone. I think it's been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you, Tanmay, for kind of leading us through this and for hearing everyone's kind of thoughts and experiences and things that they've gone. I've really, really enjoyed it. I think for me, one of the takeaways is that I think this is holistic. Looking at DEI and kind of probably on your point you just said, Adrienne, is we can't just focus in on kind of the internal, like we said, with the data that we're dealing with. We've got to think about all those influences that can come in to kind of push the needle in terms of belonging, push the needle on inclusivity, and making sure people feel that they can kind of be themselves, making sure they be themselves in the workplace that they work in, and in society. So I think we've all got responsibility for both, and it's kind of blending a bit more in terms of our responsibility as companies and organizations for our societal impact. So I think that's a big takeaway.
Yeah, so I think, so first, thank you very much for having us. And I think this conversation has highlighted how many different ways there are to look at DE&I and to take action. And I would encourage, especially for those companies that are earlier on in their journey, that anything, even a simple analysis can be very powerful. So, and certainly the more sophisticated analyses will bring us a lot further, but there's also a lot of power and a lot of compelling information that can be used in even just very simple types of people analytics work.
Yeah, so important. I think sometimes people get into the weeds of digging into things too much and forget that you need to just start somewhere, right? Even if it's not sophisticated, even if it's simple, just start, because at the end of the day, you're impacting people's lives, their livelihood, their communities, their experience, their well-being. And if you spend too much time trying to chase perfection, you're leaving people suffering while you're on that journey towards perfection. So just start and get the ball rolling. So thank you. And that leaves us with Roxanne.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm thinking back to what is the title of this panel, and it's how the next wave of people analytics can really push DEI&B efforts further. And I think we've really started to capture that at the end, that as leaders in this space, we have I think a really big obligation to get people in the business, in and outside of our organization, to think more broadly about what it means. It's not just a dashboard. It's not just metrics. It is what is the theoretical foundation that underlies this, is what is the culture and the commitment we want to create in our organization, so that we know all of our employees feel valued, feel that they belong. What is our strategy around supplier diversity, crew diversity, customer diversity, right? So I think as a people analytics leader, I challenge everybody to really think more broadly and start to push your leaders to think more broadly about what this is and how we really need to think about measuring it and evaluating our outcomes very differently.